The Iconoclast, an Anti-Philosophy by Samuel Barnes. To my parents for giving me the fire behind my eyes. Part 1. The Meta Question. When asked about my interest in philosophy, inwardly I would enter a state of panic, reliably responding with some platitudinal statement regarding the search for meanings of life or concern over ethical matters. It appears that my answer to the question, what is philosophy, was actually on the order of what I wanted philosophy to be, what I wished the inquiry to confirm intellectually and personally. Something to the effect that I had taken it up as an interest was my justification initially. I now know that philosophy is no hobby. It was only through the process of philosophy itself that this was revealed and realized. Only the experience of going through philosophy can reveal what philosophy actually is. The intellectual grinding of the cognitive process, if approached sincerely, replaces the presumptuously affirmed personal mythos and desires of the philosophical subject. The true impetus for my inner anxieties and frantic justification became clear. Philosophy is the question. Philosophy is the ultimate question. Or, as I think it is technically accurate to say, the question of questions. Philosophy is the meta question. All other fields of intellectual inquiry instantiate a foundation from which axiomatic footing can be found. Science asserts the primacy of empiricism, along with an assumptive materialism. Religion leverages metaphysical precepts as the foundations for a moral system, and even the various contemporary schools of philosophy are united by their first principles to the assertive or negative. I refer to these walled gardens of intellectual activity as sub-questions. Philosophy proper, however, is on the outside of all such cognitive enclosures. Philosophy's status as the meta-question can be demonstrated by the fact that it emanates from and is cast upon everything simultaneously at all times. It appears anything can be thought about philosophically. It appears all action and inaction projects a philosophical judgment, regardless of any supposed intentionality of nihilism. The apparatus of philosophy is what gives itself this unique and unbounded status. For each and every X, there is a philosophy of X. For example, philosophy of science, philosophy of music, philosophy of religion, philosophy of ethics, or philosophy of canned goods. Philosophy is the intellectual leviathan. The meta-question contains the superset of sub-questions. A sub-question is a demoted reality revolving around predefined parameters and rules. The subset of the meta-question is the theoretically infinite set of innumerable intellectual fields of inquiry, hence discovered or with the potential for formal generation. In their generation through cognitive activity, these fields of inquiry snap into view, becoming visible and explorable sub-questions the moment that they are conceptualized. It is the immutable foundations of these which instantiates their shape, making them cognitively viable for the human subject. These are, at this stage, irrevocably amputated and differentiated from the shapeless meta-question. Science is a philosophy, but philosophy isn't a science. We approach the meta-question with distinctly human questions, in search of human answers, having the audacity to wonder why we are constantly disappointed with the inhumanity pure logic presents us. Just as the philosopher appears to be on the cusp of finally decentering anthropomorphism, they become swallowed back up into tacky sentimentality, constructing walls where there should be none. These human structures become ever more adorned by gaudy knickknacks of our fallibility. Sub-questions are further elaborated with their own sub-questions, which overlap to some extent in their assumptions. These cathedrals of cognitive activity are pretenders to the sorts of ultimate truth which the intellect cries out for, but the human substrate can't handle. Instead, we find an anthropomorphic foundation, proceeding to draw a border around a limited intellectual domain, constructing paradisical walled gardens of knowledge. The terrain of the meta-question is littered with such sub-questions. We have ultimately restricted philosophy in our pretense that it can have any sort of basis, pretending that it can be taught. You can actually do physics or pottery, but it's an exceptional occurrence for someone to actually do philosophy, and even rarer that the effort is prolonged across a meaningful period. The apparatus of the beast only becomes clear once entered through the intellectual arrogance of axiomatic presupposition. The human cognitive ego expects to find meaningful justification for all things along with intellectual prestige. These desires remain unfulfilled as the philosophical subject is relegated to the rank of cognitive earthworm and is left floating aimlessly in an untethered space. This is what makes what is philosophy such an overdone and exhausted question, which by its foundational nature has also dulled the entire philosophical space. The true inhuman nature of the philosophical apparatus is ignored in favour of pretense and normative desire. What we want to find retards our cognitive inquiry. What is philosophy is an industry of intellectual fraud, fueled by the hubris of our conceited dogmatism. This book is an attempt to expose the vanity of these cottage industries before any more paper is wasted and ink is spilled in cognitive masturbation. My goal is to suspend dogmatic judgment as has hitherto poisoned this question, to find an honest outlook, the substantive practicalities of philosophical investigation, and the limits of intellectual cognition must be considered. To answer sincerely will require using the apparatus of philosophy itself. In this regard, nothing is off the table, and our findings could be intellectually inhuman, yet unblemished by the false certainty of dogmatic judgment. Our very potential to conduct ourselves philosophically, along with the genuine value of philosophy, will be brought into question. The impetus to justify ourselves personally and our constructed definitions of philosophy are my diagnosis of the dishonesty in philosophy thus far, and the remedy is that these comfort-driven impulses must be abandoned in the landfill of intellectual history. What are we even expecting once philosophy is done exactly? Isn't the point of a telos that there actually is a goal? As the dogmatic empirical sciences claim to be approaching their solution, iconoclastic philosophy simply generates more questions. The construction of sub-questions kindly provides nourishment for the intellectual leviathan, resulting in the continuous generation of an ever-expanding task for those willing to venture beyond the walls of more sensible inquiry. As an uninhabitable space, the meta-question has a tendency to solidify into schools when inhabited by man. These adopt our natural tribalism and become warring sub-questions, fiefdoms of cognitive specialization, providing temporary shelter for injured travellers, philosophical retirement homes for senior academics, and amusements of novelty for those who merely like to dip their toes as an interest. In reality, philosophy will never be done. It can't be, at least not by us. Many will never realise this and remain trapped in the ephemera of dogmatic debate. Most will never care to acknowledge the reality which is the great meta-question in the first instance. Philosophy is not just one of the many intellectual burdens of life, but also the meta-burden. We actually don't know where we came from. We actually don't know where we are going. Philosophy even questions the legitimacy of the very present. What we do have is a cognitive happening, an awareness of the process which we are dragged through willingly or otherwise. An awareness that, for our sanity, it probably best we were distracted from. Simple acknowledgement of the dizzying reality of the cognitive landscape is what people are referring to when they accuse others of overthinking. These described intellectual zones, the meta-question and the set of sub-questions, both serve interrelated purposes for our ability to prospect and explore intellectually. The inhabitants of these zones in the meta-inquisitive map of the intellect are best conceptualized through archetypes of thinking. These mental models are an attempt to present intellectual ideals which aim to allow us to commune with the cognitive zones of philosophy. The inhabitants of the aforementioned zones are the dogmatist within the sub-question and the iconoclast within the meta-question. I present these approximations to assist with the mental visualization of the hierarchy in intellectual inquiry, from the all-encompassing meta-question of philosophy through the set of relegated sub-questions. The interplay at work between the set of sub-questions and the meta-question is the eternal conflict between the dogmatist and the iconoclast. The dogmatist forms orderly walls within which tranquility can be fostered, yet also stagnation allowed to take root. The iconoclast inhabits the meta-question, thinking through walls and uncovering the endless philosophical fog. The normative place of active philosophy is with the iconoclast, but everyone has to retire at some point. Although the dogmatic urge and the iconoclastic impulse form two parts of the same intellectual whole, their cognitive archetypes cannot be dogmatic and iconoclastic at the same time. Temporally speaking, there are personal and wider zeitgeist shifts of the philosophical mental framing. For example, there are epochs in which it's iconoclastic to evoke inquiry into order in the intellectual environment of a chaotic zeitgeist. Conversely, there are intellectual movements where a dogmatic revolution decimates boundaries in its process of construction. Eternally, the dogmatic urge and the iconoclastic impulse pull on the human intellect and collectively bring us into respective eras of dogmatism and iconoclasm.